Good morning. Good to see you this morning. I want to share a list of names with you this morning and ask the question, what do these men have in common here this morning? So let me read the names. Anthony Weiner, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Tiger Woods, Jonathan Edwards, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, Kobe Bryant, Bill Clinton, and King David. What do they have in common, right? I really hesitated to read that first name because I think we've heard well too much about this particular person in our lives in the news lately. But these all men have been men in leadership or in power or in positions where they have abused that position of power. And they have become kind of feeling as though they're above any type of conduct. And that there is actually, they've been studying in psychology, that psychologists are now talking about this, not only the media, but in a book by Robert Weiss, in his book, he wrote a book called Why Men in Power Act Out. He writes this: if their narcissism or egotism isn't matched by a healthy dose of humility of what it means to be human, and they run on their intellect and don't attend to their emotions on any level, then they are bound for trouble. That how often we can get to that place, too, where we run on just our intellect, or we run on just our own level of emotional health or lack of health, rather than allowing ourselves to be humble, to remind ourselves that we're human, that we are flawed. You know, King David was in that list, wasn't he? And if you know anything about King David is in the Bible where we read about part of his life here this morning. But King David was actually a great leader in the nation of Israel during a very difficult time in Israel's life. And he was a good king and a good leader, and yet he had this indiscretion with Bathsheba. That's what he's known for. He's actually known, he's remembered for two things. One, killing a giant, and then he's known for his indiscretion with Bathsheba. And that's what we typically remember about King David. But the story we heard read this morning, so well pronounced. Yeah, you can give a hand for that. That was a tough passage. We were joking around before the service and about all the tricks of the trade, which those are trade secrets we can't reveal here this morning. But if you're ever going to read Scripture in the service, we'll give you our trade secrets, right? Okay. All right. So David is here, and he have this passage, and it's interesting that what's happening here is that this is at the end of his reign. It's at the end of the book of 2 Samuel, and it's recording an event about King David. It's recording an event about his leadership. And the event is this, in this list of mighty men, it's really talking about these men who fought for David, but this particular event always struck me as interesting and interesting in the way David handled it. You see, this episode, which they're talking about here in 2 Samuel, even though it's at the end of the book, actually happened earlier in his reign as king, earlier when he had just become king of Israel. And the Philistines had come, and they had taken and surrounded the town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem was David's hometown. This is where he grew up as a child. This was where he was a shepherd boy, is in the town of Bethlehem, the city of David, where also Christ was born. But it's in this, so Philistines have this territory, and David is just kind of longingly wishing for a drink from the well that he remembered as a boy and as a shepherd of going to that well and getting a drink of water. He probably had long, fond memories of drinking out of that well. And so he just, on a whim, just says out loud how he would love to have a drink from that well. And these three men, thought to themselves, hey, we'll do this for our king. And so they go and they fight their way through the Philistine lines, and they go through, they get some water from the well of Bethlehem, and they bring it back to David. And David takes the water, and he pours it out on the ground. Now think about that. He takes this water, and he pours it out on the ground, and he gives it as an offering to the Lord. Why is he doing this? What's going on here with David? Well, one thing that I think that David is doing is as a leader at this moment has to make a critical choice, doesn't he? He's making a choice as a leader, and he's saying, am I going to allow these men to worship me? As this is an act of, in a sense, an act of worship, has this interpretation. Or am I going to point them to God? Am I going to point them to God, or am I going to take this on and just quench my own thirst and do the selfish thing that I would like to do right now? Or am I going to give this to God? Am I going to point them to God? And that's what good leaders do. That's what good men do, is they don't worship themselves. They don't think that they're above everybody else. They point other people to worship God. And so what David is doing for his men is he is saying, I want you guys to worship God. I am not to be worshiped. I am a flawed human being. Don't worship me. See, at this point in time, David understands humility as a leader and the importance of humility and pointing others towards God. See, he understands at this point in his career that it's not all about him. Do you know people who think it's all about them? You know what I'm talking about? It's all about them and what's going to be best for them and how they can use it for their own needs, ego needs. Well, maybe you've come across this guy in some other place. Let's run that tape. Or that video, I should say, tape.
It's all about me, really.
It is all about you. Now, the greatest collection of me worship ever assembled on one CD.
It's all about now I lift my name on high.
All 20 songs, all about you.
My praises, I exalt me.
This amazing collection is great to share with friends, if you have any. Everyone can join in the worship with you, for you, and about you. Because you are unique, and you love you.
There is none like me. No one else.
All this for only $19.95. Operators are standing by to serve you.
And I am why I sing, and I am why I live.
If you order now, you'll also receive a second CD of Yuletide favorites. Call 1-800-ME-ME-ME or order online at memyselfandi.com. Call today because no one can praise you like you.
All right, good. You know anybody like that? You know, the world revolves around them, you know, it's all about them. I think we even get like that sometimes too, can't we? But it's interesting that even though David sat on a throne, I think in his own heart God was enthroned. Does that make sense? That for David, God was still enthroned in his heart. Even though he was a leader on a throne, he kept God in right position within his own heart and his own mind. In this example of leadership, he is saying to his men, it's not about me. It's not all about me. It is about God. We worship God, not men, not leaders, not those that are human. And so David goes on, and I wonder about... we think about what was going on in David's mind, but I wonder what was going on in the men, in their minds. You know, I mean, think about it. They just fought their way, risked their lives for a drink of water. They were trying to impress their leader. They were trying to do something great for their leader. And here they had broken through Philistine lines, gotten this water, risked their lives, brought it back to David. And I can imagine the three of them standing there like, oh yeah, say, here, take a drink and thank us for what we've done. And David doesn't do that. I wonder what was going on in their minds when David poured it out on the ground. I think about that. And I think about what ran through their minds. And I don't know because the text doesn't tell us. I can only speculate as to what they were thinking. Like, oh my goodness, what did we do that for? Why did we do that? Doesn't he understand how we risked our lives? And yet I think over time, I think it maybe took them a little while, but I'm hoping that at some level they began to realize that they were serving a leader who was not going to abuse his power. I think that at some level I'm hoping that they understood that David could be trusted with what he had been given as a leader. That he wasn't just going to use it for his own selfish purposes. That he was humble enough to give it to God. It's interesting that this is what's recorded. This stays in the Bible. This could have not even been included in the Bible, but here at the end of David's life, this is what is mentioned. I think about that, and I think about how David was also setting an example for his men of what it means to be humble. Because humility really is not a lack of power. We often think to be humble or meek is to be weak. But humility is not a lack of power. Humility is wisely using power for others' good or for God's good. That when we're humble, we use our position of power, we use whatever authority we have, we use it to bless others, to build others up, rather than to just use it for our own selfish needs. Humility is power under control. As a dad, I remember taking my girls to the beach, and when they were like younger, like 5 and 7, and we would go to the beach, and I'd sit there in the chair, and I'd have my book out ready to read and just relax. But 5 and 7-year-old girls don't want to do that, do they? They don't want to relax. Dad's ready to relax, but they're running around, come play with us, build a sandcastle with us. And so finally, after long enough of their prodding, I finally get out of the chair, and I get up, and we build this sandcastle with them. And we put the moat in, and we put up the towers, and they're out collecting shells and decorating the castle with seaweed and shells, because that's got, this is a girl's castle, I'm just the engineer, I'm just the architect here, but they're the designers. And so we get this, and we spent about 2 hours on this sandcastle, building this sandcastle. Finally, the sandcastle is complete, and everybody is happy, and I'm ready to go back in my chair and start reading my book again. And as I sit back down in the chair, and the girls go to play in the ocean, and I'm reading my book, I glance up over the pages of my book, and I see this young boy coming down the beach. And he just walks right through the sandcastle, stomping it down, destroying it, and kept walking on. And you think about that, and I think, how do I use my power here at this point, right? I didn't do anything, because that's what happens to sandcastles. They wash away, and that's why Jesus said, build your house on the rock, not on the sand. But those are two different uses of power, aren't they? And even though I was bigger and stronger than him, and maybe I had more power, I used my power to create something, my strength to create something, to build something. Whereas this younger person, this younger boy, used his strength and power to destroy something. And I think about that. Isn't that how power works? We can either use it to create and build up something or someone, or we can use it to destroy something or someone. I think our role as leaders, as those with power, and if you think you don't have power, I would ask you to guess again. We all, at some level, at some place in our lives, have power and authority. Maybe it's in our family structure. Maybe it's at our workplaces. Maybe it's in our church. Maybe it's in our homes, wherever it may be. And how we wield it, how we use it, we have a choice, just like David did. We can use that power to build up and to create, or we can use it to destroy. It's our choice in how we use it. And really, it's about how emotionally mature each of us is, whether or not we use it wisely, isn't it? Because the more emotional maturity I have, the less ego needs I have to fulfill. The less needs I have to make myself feel better. So if I'm emotionally mature, then I'm able to really invest in other people around me. One last thing about this passage today. It's actually not in the passage, but at the very end of chapter 23, actually we didn't read it, but it goes on because it lists out 30 men that fought for David. 30 mighty men that were talked about in King David's reign, and they're listed here. And I want to read to you the very last name in the list. It comes in the last verse of the chapter, verse 39 says, Uriah the Hittite. Now, if you don't know who Uriah is, Uriah was the husband of Bathsheba. Uriah was the man that David had killed because of his indiscretion with Bathsheba. He put him out on the front lines, had the troops back away from him, so he was left alone, and he was killed in battle. David set him up. I think about that is that even as the Bible is remembering David's leadership early in his reign, this name stands out as a sore thumb, doesn't it, in David's life? The very last verse names the man that he had killed, which is a reminder, again, the Bible is reminding us we worship God, not men. We worship not kings and leaders, we worship God. And what it is saying is because all leaders, all men and women, and all of us are flawed, are we not? We're all flawed. None of us are perfect. And it's a reminder that King David was also flawed. But the promise of God here this morning, the promise of God is that God is in the business of recreating people, right? Because God uses power not to ultimately destroy, but God uses power to resurrect, to recreate, to transform, to forgive people who are flawed. That's how God uses power. And that's the hope that all of us have, that no matter how flawed we are as human beings, we still have the hope of resurrection. We still have the hope of transformation in our lives. Amen? Amen.